My name is Lisa Chen, and I'm writing this from my apartment in Brooklyn 3 years after spending 2020 and 2021 working 12-hour shifts as a nurse in a New York City hospital treating COVID-19 patients during the deadliest phases of the pandemic, risking my life daily providing care to a community that simultaneously blamed me for the disease, assaulted me verbally and physically for my Asian face, and made me terrified to wear my scrubs on the subway because racist strangers would scream, "China virus!" and go back to China at a Brooklyn-born fourth-generation Chinese American whose grandparents immigrated in 1885. At 32, I experienced the most intense professional and personal trauma of my life as I watched patients die from COVID-19 while being called disease carrier and blamed for causing the pandemic by people who couldn't distinguish between Chinese Americans and the Chinese government, who viewed all Asian faces as foreign regardless of citizenship or generational status, and who needed someone to blame for their fear and loss while political leaders explicitly encouraged racist scapegoating. Through China virus and Kung flu, rhetoric that weaponized Asian bodies as acceptable targets for violence that exploded by 339% nationally during the pandemic years. The pandemic racism began almost immediately after COVID-19 emerged as a public health crisis in early 2020, when political leaders and media outlets started using racialized language like China virus, Wuhan virus, and Kung flu that explicitly connected the disease to Chinese ethnicity and Asian identity rather than using the medically appropriate terminology that avoided stigmatizing entire ethnic groups. As a healthcare worker, I understood that virus naming conventions specifically avoided geographic or ethnic associations to prevent exactly the kind of discrimination that was now being encouraged from the highest levels of government. The first verbal assault happened in March 2020 when I was commuting home from a particularly brutal shift during which 3 patients had died from COVID-19, and a man on the subway saw me in my scrubs and started screaming that I was spreading disease, that people like me had brought the virus to America, and that I should go back to China. Other passengers watched silently as he continued his tirade, getting closer to me while yelling about the China virus, and I sat frozen with fear, exhausted from work, traumatized by the deaths I had just witnessed, and now being blamed for the pandemic I was literally risking my life to fight. The scrubs danger meant I stopped wearing my hospital scrubs during my commute, changing at the hospital before leaving despite my exhaustion, because wearing visible markers of being a healthcare worker combined with my Asian face made me a target for racist harassment from people who simultaneously demanded that medical workers save them from COVID while blaming Asian Americans for causing the disease. The contradiction was absurd but deadly serious, as I navigated a city where my profession should have generated gratitude but my race generated hatred. The Chinatown attacks escalated throughout 2020 as my elderly parents, who lived in Manhattan's Chinatown and operated a small grocery store they had run for 30 years, experienced increasing harassment and ultimately physical assault from people blaming Chinese Americans for COVID-19. My 70-year-old father was shoved to the ground by a stranger who called him disease and blamed him for killing Americans, resulting in a broken hip that required surgery and months of recovery, during which my parents' store remained closed and their income disappeared while medical bills accumulated. The parent terror was overwhelming as I realized my parents weren't safe in the community they had lived in for 4 decades, that their age and limited English made them particularly vulnerable to attacks, and that I couldn't protect them while also working 12-hour hospital shifts during a pandemic that was killing thousands of people daily. The fear for their safety competed with my professional obligations to my patients, creating impossible stress as I tried to convince my parents to stay home while they worried about their store, their income, and their survival, both physical and economic. The hospital patient racism emerged as some COVID patients or their family members would specifically request non-Asian nurses, express suspicion about whether I had been to China recently, make comments about the China virus while I was treating them, or refuse my care entirely based on the belief that my Asian face meant I was somehow connected to COVID-19 despite my being a fourth-generation American who had never even visited China. The racism from patients I was risking my life to care for was particularly devastating because it revealed that even my professional role and sacrifice couldn't overcome the racial scapegoating that marked all Asian faces as enemy. The hospital administration failure happened when I and other Asian healthcare workers reported the racism we were experiencing from patients and asked for institutional support. And hospital leadership offered only vague statements about diversity and inclusion without implementing any concrete protections, policies for addressing patient racism, or acknowledgement that Asian healthcare workers were facing unique dangers both inside the hospital from racist patients and outside the hospital from community violence, while simultaneously doing the essential and dangerous work of treating COVID patients. The daughter's bullying began when schools transitioned to remote learning and then eventually returned to in-person instruction, and my 8-year-old daughter Emma started being called coronavirus, bat eater, and China girl by classmates who had absorbed the racist rhetoric about COVID-19's origins and connected it to Emma's Asian face despite her being born in New York and having no connection to China beyond ancestral heritage 4 generations removed. The bullying was both verbal and physical, with students refusing to sit near her, making exaggerated coughing sounds when she walked by, and blaming her for the pandemic that had disrupted their lives. The school response inadequacy mirrored the hospital's failure as Emma's teachers and school administrators acknowledged the bullying was concerning but offered only generic anti-bullying interventions without addressing the specific anti-Asian racism that was the actual problem, without educating students about how scapegoating and xenophobia operate, and without creating consequences for racist behavior beyond treating it as general meanness rather than racist violence that was part of a national crisis of anti-Asian hate crimes. The community surveillance became constant as I became hypervigilant about potential threats whenever leaving my apartment, scanning for hostile faces, avoiding eye contact, taking circuitous routes to avoid areas where I had experienced harassment, and living with constant cortisol spikes from the chronic danger of existing in public space with an Asian face during a period when political leaders had explicitly encouraged viewing Asian Americans as responsible for a pandemic killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. The grocery store attack happened when I was shopping at a supermarket in my neighborhood and a woman started screaming at me that I had brought disease to America, that people like me were killing grandparents, and that I should be ashamed for showing my face in public. The assault escalated when she grabbed items from my cart and threw them at me while other shoppers watched without intervening, and store security eventually escorted her out but didn't call police or file any kind of incident report despite the clear assault and racist harassment I had just experienced. The subway terror intensified as attacks on Asian Americans using public transportation became frequent and well documented, with elders being shoved onto tracks, people being slashed, and constant verbal harassment creating an environment where taking the subway to work at the hospital felt genuinely dangerous. I started taking expensive Ubers that consumed significant portions of my salary, but felt I had no choice given the escalating violence targeting Asian Americans on public transportation that the city seemed unable or unwilling to prevent. The elder murders that occurred throughout 2020 to 2021 were the most traumatic aspect of the anti-Asian violence pandemic, as Asian American elders were killed in unprovoked attacks across the country while being blamed for COVID-19. Every news report of another elder murdered felt personal because they looked like my parents. They were being killed for the same crime of having Asian faces, and each death reinforced that the danger wasn't paranoia but very real violence that political scapegoating had unleashed and encouraged. The Vicha Ratanapakdi murder in San Francisco of an 84-year-old Thai-American man who was violently shoved to the ground and killed in an unprovoked attack was particularly devastating because he was doing something as ordinary as taking a morning walk, because the violence was so extreme and unprovoked, and because it could have been my father who had already been assaulted once and was still recovering from his injuries. The collective trauma in the Asian American community was profound as we mourned strangers who felt like family because we recognized that any of us could be next. The Atlanta spa shootings in March 2021 that killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, represented an escalation of anti-Asian violence that the perpetrator and some law enforcement initially tried to deny was racially motivated despite the obvious targeting of Asian-owned businesses and Asian women. The murders revealed how anti-Asian racism intersected with misogyny to create particular vulnerabilities for Asian women, and how even deadly violence against our community was minimized, denied, and attributed to perpetrators' bad day, rather than acknowledged as the racist hate crimes they were. The Stop Asian Hate movement, that emerged in response to the escalating violence provided some community solidarity and public attention to anti-Asian hate crimes, but also revealed tensions about whether the movement would lead to meaningful change or just performative allyship. As rallies occurred and hashtags trended, I was participating in protests while also working hospital shifts during a pandemic, while also protecting my parents, while also supporting my traumatized daughter, while also navigating my own daily experiences of racism and fear. The mental health crisis that all of this created was profound and multifaceted. PTSD from the combination of treating dying COVID patients and experiencing racist violence, hypervigilance and anxiety about public spaces, rage about the political scapegoating that had created danger for my community, guilt about not being able to protect my parents or daughter, and grief about the elders who had been killed. The accumulated trauma was overwhelming, but finding mental health care that understood the specific intersections of pandemic healthcare workers' stress and anti-Asian racist violence was difficult. The therapy that finally helped was with Dr. Amy Nguyen, a Vietnamese-American psychologist who specialized in racial trauma and understood that my experience wasn't just about individual incidents, but about systematic scapegoating that had targeted an entire community, and who validated that the trauma was real and the danger was real even as the pandemic eventually subsided and public attention to anti-Asian hate crimes waned before the violence had actually stopped or the underlying conditions that produced it had been addressed. The anti-Asian violence during COVID-19 wasn't new. It was a resurgence of yellow peril racism that has always existed in America, but became activated during a crisis when political leaders needed scapegoats, Dr. Nguyen explained during one of our sessions. The model minority myth that positioned Asian Americans as successful and non-threatening transformed instantly into yellow peril when white America was scared and needed someone to blame. Your experience of risking your life as a healthcare worker while being blamed for the disease you were fighting captures the fundamental contradiction of Asian American existence, simultaneously essential and foreign, valued for contributions but never truly belonging, included during stability but scapegoated during crisis. She helped me understand that the anger I felt was appropriate response to injustice, that the hypervigilance was adaptive response to real danger rather than paranoia, and that healing required both individual therapeutic work and collective community action to address the systematic racism that had been revealed and activated during the pandemic. The personal and political were inseparable when the trauma resulted from politically encouraged violence. The community organizing work that emerged from my trauma included connecting with Asian American advocacy organizations like Asian Americans Advancing Justice, participating in Stop Asian Hate initiatives, documenting hate crimes and harassment that often went unreported, and pushing for policy changes that would address anti-Asian violence through education, hate crime enforcement, community support, and challenging the political rhetoric that had encouraged scapegoating in the first place. The policy advocacy included pushing for hate crime legislation that specifically addressed anti-Asian violence, federal tracking and reporting of anti-Asian hate crimes that had been significantly underreported, funding for community safety initiatives in Asian American neighborhoods, and education about the historical patterns of anti-Asian racism in America that created conditions for pandemic scapegoating to activate long-standing yellow peril tropes. The healthcare worker advocacy involved organizing with other Asian American healthcare workers to demand that hospitals acknowledge the specific racism and violence we faced, implement protections including zero-tolerance policies for patient racism, provide mental health support for healthcare workers experiencing racial trauma, and recognize that Asian healthcare workers faced disproportionate burdens during the pandemic as we risked our lives professionally while being blamed racially for the disease we were fighting. The education work included speaking at schools, community organizations, and public events about anti-Asian racism, the political scapegoating that occurred during COVID-19, and the historical context of yellow peril that made Asian Americans vulnerable to violence during crisis periods. The education emphasized that anti-Asian racism wasn't just about individual prejudice, but about systematic patterns that required collective understanding and action to address. The intergenerational trauma work involved supporting my parents' recovery, both from my father's physical assault injuries and from the psychological trauma of being attacked in the community where they had lived and worked for 40 years, helping them process the betrayal of being targeted by neighbors and customers they had served for decades, and acknowledging that they would likely never feel fully safe again in ways that fundamentally changed their relationship to America and their identity as Americans. The daughter's healing required family therapy to address Emma's trauma from bullying and from absorbing the fear and stress that our entire family was experiencing, helping her develop pride in her Asian American identity rather than shame about the face that had made her a target, and working with her school to implement more robust anti-racist education that would prevent future students from absorbing the racist rhetoric that had harmed Emma and countless other Asian American children. During the pandemic, the advocacy for bystander intervention training became important as I recognized that many of the racist incidents I and others experienced occurred in the presence of witnesses who did nothing, either from discomfort, lack of knowledge about how to intervene, or from not recognizing the incidents as serious threats requiring intervention. Training people to actively interrupt racist harassment rather than being passive bystanders could potentially prevent escalation to physical violence. Today, 3 years after the peak of anti-Asian pandemic violence, I continue working as a nurse while also serving as an advocate and organizer addressing ongoing anti-Asian racism that didn't disappear when COVID-19 transitioned from pandemic to endemic disease. The violence decreased from its 2020 to 2021 peaks, but anti-Asian hate crimes remain elevated compared to pre-pandemic levels, revealing that the scapegoating activated long-standing racism rather than creating temporary aberration. The community healing remains incomplete as the Asian American community continues processing collective trauma from the pandemic violence, mourning the elders we lost, supporting survivors of attacks, and working to ensure that the political scapegoating that endangered our community is remembered and addressed rather than forgotten as America moves past the acute pandemic crisis without accountability for the racist rhetoric that weaponized Asian bodies as acceptable targets for violence. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with providers who understand racial trauma and the specific intersections of healthcare workers' stress and anti-Asian violence helps process complex trauma. Community organizing through organizations like Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Stop AAPI Hate, and local coalitions provides collective action and solidarity. Policy advocacy for hate crime legislation, federal tracking of anti-Asian hate crimes, and community safety funding addresses systematic problems. Healthcare worker organizing pushes hospitals to acknowledge and address racism that Asian healthcare workers experience from patients. Education initiatives about anti-Asian racism, political scapegoating, and historical context prevent future violence by addressing root causes. Bystander intervention training empowers witnesses to actively interrupt racist harassment rather than remaining passive. Family therapy addresses intergenerational trauma and helps children heal from racist bullying while developing positive ethnic identity. Documentation of hate crimes and harassment creates visibility for violence that often goes unreported and unaddressed. Today, when people suggest that anti-Asian violence during COVID-19 was understandable fear response to a pandemic, I explain that I spent 2020 to 2021 saving lives while being blamed for taking them, that political leaders deliberately scapegoated Asian Americans to deflect from their own failures, and that the 339% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes wasn't inevitable, but was the direct result of racist rhetoric that activated long-standing yellow peril tropes and weaponized my face as enemy. I'm a fourth-generation American, a frontline healthcare worker, and a survivor of violence that my community will never forget, even if America wants to move on without accountability for the racist scapegoating that nearly killed my family.